She wasn't just a flight attendant, she was the woman who made every mile in the sky feel like the beginning of something I never saw coming. I boarded the late evening flight expecting nothing more than cramped seats and restless sleep. The hum of the engines was steady, the lights inside dimmed to a muted glow, and the scent of coffee lingered faintly in the air. People moved past one another, half distracted, tired, just wanting the journey to end. Then she appeared. She walked down the aisle with the kind of calm that made time slow just slightly, her uniform perfectly in place, her hair neatly tied back yet softened by a few strands framing her face. She carried herself with the poise of someone who had spent years crossing skies, but there was something else too, a warmth in her presence that made it impossible not to notice. When her eyes met mine, just for a fraction of a second, I felt a small jolt, not dramatic, just enough to make me sit up straighter, as if I had been seen in a way I hadn't expected. She smiled politely, a professional gesture, yet her gaze lingered a little longer than it needed to. As she leaned over to check the overhead bin near my seat, I caught the subtle fragrance of her perfume, not overpowering, but clean, elegant, carrying with it the faint trace of citrus and something deeper I couldn't place. Her sleeve brushed against my shoulder lightly, an accidental touch, but enough to make my skin aware of every nerve beneath it. I told myself it was nothing. Just part of the flight. Just another attendant doing her job. But the truth is, I couldn't shake the quiet steadiness she carried, the way her voice over the intercom had that low, reassuring tone when she said, "Fasten your seatbelts." There was a story in her eyes, I could feel it. Not sadness exactly, but the kind of depth that comes from years of experience, from knowing both turbulence and calm in life. And sitting there, I found myself strangely awake, more attentive than I had been in weeks, wondering why someone like her, graceful, confident, yet quietly vulnerable in ways I couldn't define, had captured my attention so completely. This was supposed to be an ordinary flight. But as the plane prepared for takeoff, something told me this journey was going to be different. The flight leveled out, and the low rumble of the engines became almost like background music. Around me, passengers settled into their routines, some opening laptops, some pulling blankets over their shoulders. I kept pretending to read a magazine, but the truth was, I was waiting for her to come back down the aisle. When she finally did, offering water and soft drinks with the same patient professionalism, I felt an inexplicable rush of nerves. She leaned slightly toward me, the dim cabin lights catching the soft lines of her face. "Something to drink?" she asked. Her voice was calm, low, the kind of voice that carried steadiness even in turbulence. I almost asked for coffee just to prolong the exchange, but instead I said quietly, "Water's fine, thank you." Her smile curved, polite at first, but then something gentler touched her expression, as if she noticed my hesitation. She handed me the glass, our fingers brushing for the briefest moment. Cool condensation against my skin, her touch warm and unhurried. That fleeting contact felt far more significant than it should have. I cleared my throat, summoning the courage I wasn't sure I had. "Do you ever get tired of flying?" Her eyebrows lifted, surprised. Most people probably asked her about destinations or schedules, but not that. She studied me for a second, as though deciding how honest to be. "Sometimes," she admitted, her voice softer now. "But then there are nights like this, when it feels peaceful." She glanced briefly out the small window, where the sky was an endless stretch of deep navy, scattered with stars. Her answer lingered in me. There was weight behind it, not a rehearsed reply, but a glimpse into who she was beyond the uniform. "I can see that," I said, my voice lower than I intended. "It doesn't feel like we're in the middle of hundreds of strangers. It feels quieter." Her lips pressed into the faintest smile, the kind that carried a secret. She gave a small nod before moving on to the next row, her perfume drifting faintly in her wake. But the moment didn't vanish. It sat there between us, unspoken yet alive. A single question, a single honest answer, enough to turn an ordinary exchange into something far more personal. And for the rest of the flight, I found myself waiting, wondering when her path would cross mine again. The cabin had grown quieter as the hours stretched on. Most passengers were dozing off, their heads tilted against windows, blankets drawn up to their chins. The lights were dimmed, leaving only the soft glow of reading lamps scattered here and there, like stars across the ceiling. I had been staring at the same page of my book for nearly 20 minutes when I noticed her returning from the galley. She wasn't in a rush now, no cart to push, no announcements to make. Her steps were measured, and for a moment, it felt as though she was simply wandering through the night sky with us. When she reached my row, she leaned slightly against the empty seat across the aisle. "Still awake?" she asked quietly, careful not to disturb those around us. I smiled faintly. Trying to be. Her eyes flicked to the book in my hands, then back to me. "Anything interesting?" "Not as much as this conversation," I admitted before I could stop myself. Heat touched my cheeks instantly, too forward, maybe. But instead of pulling away, her lips curved into a slow smile, as though she wasn't used to being spoken to like that. She slid into the empty seat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her even in the cool cabin air. "Don't worry," she said softly. "I'll only sit for a minute." The nearness of her was almost overwhelming. The faint rustle of her uniform when she shifted. The brush of her arm against the armrest, close but not quite touching mine. Her perfume was subtler now, blending with the faint scent of brewed coffee drifting from the galley. We spoke in hushed tones, the kind reserved for midnight conversations when the world feels half asleep. She told me little things, about routes she liked, cities that always felt like home, the way flying had become both escape and routine. Her voice carried a quiet honesty, and I found myself listening not just to her words but to the pauses between them. At one point, as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her hand brushed lightly against mine on the armrest. Neither of us moved away immediately. The contact was brief, innocent enough to dismiss, but it lingered in my chest like a steady heartbeat. For that moment, it didn't feel like a crowded airplane at all. It felt like the two of us suspended above the world, wrapped in the hush of midnight, sharing something fragile that neither of us dared name yet. The plane had settled into the deep stillness of night. Only the hum of the engines and the occasional clink of silverware from the galley broke the silence. Most passengers slept in heavy stillness, their faces softened by dreams. But I was wide awake, my pulse steady and restless all at once. She returned quietly, her steps careful, her posture a little less formal than before. Instead of moving past me, she paused, glanced around, and then slipped once more into the empty seat beside mine. This time she didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't ask for one. For a while, we just sat there, listening to the drone of the engines, as if the quiet itself was a kind of language. Then, almost out of nowhere, she whispered, "Sometimes I wonder how long I can keep doing this." Her voice was low, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. I turned slightly toward her, surprised by her openness. "Flying?" I asked gently. Her gaze lowered, fixed on her hands resting in her lap. "Flying, running, moving from one place to another. It feels like I've been in motion my whole life." She gave a quiet laugh, but it was thin, edged with weariness. "People think this job is glamorous, but most nights it's just lonely." The honesty in her words caught me off guard. I could see it in her eyes, the years, the miles, the invisible ache she carried beneath her graceful composure. It wasn't the kind of confession she'd make to just anyone, and I felt the fragile weight of her trust settle between us. Without thinking, I shifted slightly closer. My hand rested on the armrest, open, not reaching, but waiting, an unspoken invitation. Slowly, as though she needed the reassurance, her fingers brushed against mine. This time, she didn't pull away. Her hand stayed, light but steady, as though holding on anchored her in the stillness. "I don't usually say things like this," she admitted softly, her eyes glancing toward me. "You don't have to," I murmured. "I hear it anyway." Her lips curved into a faint, almost bittersweet smile, and in that fragile moment, the cabin around us seemed to fade away. The hum of the engine softened, the world below felt impossibly distant, and it was just the two of us, suspended in the dark, bound not by words but by something quieter, stronger. The quiet calm of the night didn't last. It began with a subtle tremor, the kind that ripples through the cabin like a faint shiver. Overhead compartments rattled softly, and a few passengers stirred in their sleep. Then the plane lurched, sudden enough to send a nervous murmur through the darkened rows. She straightened immediately, her training flickering into place. I watched the shift in her posture, calm, reassuring, professional, but I caught the flicker of tension in her eyes, too. She placed a steadying hand on the seat back in front of her, her other hand brushing against mine in the motion. The lights overhead blinked as the captain's voice came through, low and composed, "Ladies and gentlemen, we've hit some unexpected turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts." Passengers scrambled, fumbling with straps and latches. She leaned toward me, her voice soft but firm. "Fasten yours." I obeyed, the buckle clicking into place. She lingered by my side longer than necessary, her hand resting briefly on my shoulder as if to ground me, or maybe to ground herself. The plane jolted again, sharper this time, and she instinctively gripped the armrest beside me, her body leaning close until her shoulder pressed lightly against mine. For a few moments, the world outside felt like chaos, unseen winds pushing us, the fuselage trembling, but inside that small pocket of space, I could feel only her. The warmth of her arm against mine. The faint brush of her hair near my cheek as she bent slightly, whispering, "It's all right. Just a patch of rough air." Her voice steadied me, but it was the nearness that truly silenced my nerves. When the plane shuddered again, harder this time, she exhaled quietly and let her hand slip over mine on the armrest. Not accidental this time, deliberate. Her fingers curled around mine, steady, strong. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. In that small, dim-lit cocoon of rattling metal and whispered reassurances, her touch said everything. Gradually, the turbulence eased. The cabin stilled, the rattle softened, and the steady hum returned. Still, she didn't pull her hand away immediately. Instead, she let it linger, her thumb brushing lightly once across my knuckles before she withdrew, her composure returning. But the silence between us was no longer the same. Something had shifted, something fragile yet undeniable, born out of turbulence but refusing to fade with calm. When the cabin finally stilled, the shift was almost startling. Passengers drifted back into uneasy sleep, their earlier fear dissolving into drowsy relief. But for me, everything had changed. My hand still tingled faintly where hers had rested, as if her warmth had left an imprint I couldn't let go of. She remained beside me longer than protocol demanded, her gaze sweeping the rows, ensuring everyone was calm. Yet her posture wasn't only about duty, it felt quieter, more personal, as though some invisible tether held her here. Finally, she exhaled, almost like a sigh she had been holding back. Her voice dropped to something softer, private. "Funny how a little turbulence reminds people what matters." I turned to her, studying the lines of her face, the strength etched there, but also the softness. "What matters to you?" I asked, careful not to sound like I was prying, though my pulse raced with anticipation. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the armrest, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her hand. Her eyes flicked to mine, steady, unflinching. Stability, she admitted at last. Connection. Something real, in a life that never stops moving. Her words landed with quiet weight. I swallowed, the air between us thick with unspoken meaning. "Maybe that's why turbulence doesn't scare me," I said, my voice low. "It makes me feel closer to what I didn't know I needed." Her lips parted, just slightly, as if she hadn't expected the confession. For a moment, neither of us looked away. The faint overhead light caught in her eyes, revealing something unguarded, longing, perhaps, or the echo of a wish she hadn't dared to speak aloud. She leaned back in the seat, shoulders brushing mine. The closeness was almost unbearable in its restraint. I could feel her warmth, the subtle rise and fall of her breath, the faint brush of fabric against my sleeve. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "You're too young to understand how dangerous moments like this can be." I should have laughed, or pulled away, or reminded myself of the lines we weren't supposed to cross. Instead, I answered honestly, "Maybe. But I do know I don't want this moment to end." Her eyes lingered on me, searching, as though weighing the risk against the truth she already felt. And for the first time, she didn't hide it, the softness, the longing, the quiet hunger that matched my own. The hours slipped by quietly after that. Conversation gave way to stretches of silence, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, where two people didn't need to speak to know what lingered between them. Eventually, the lights in the cabin brightened, soft at first, then stronger as the crew prepared for landing. A gentle announcement stirred passengers awake, the shuffle of bags and seatbelts filling the once peaceful hush. Reality was returning, drawing us closer to the ground, and with it came the unspoken question neither of us wanted to face: what happens when the flight ends? She stood to assist a passenger a few rows ahead, her poise returning, her expression once more the composed professional. But when her eyes flicked back toward me, they softened, holding just a second longer than they should have. When she returned to my row, she leaned slightly, her hand steadying against my seat. "Almost there," she said, her tone professional, but her gaze told another story, one of reluctance, of something left unfinished. I nodded, my throat dry. "I know." The plane descended, a low vibration shivering through the cabin as the runway approached. My fingers gripped the armrest, and without hesitation, hers rested lightly over mine again. It wasn't duty this time, or turbulence, or coincidence. It was a choice, quiet, deliberate, undeniable. The wheels touched down with a roar, brakes pulling us forward, passengers exhaling in relief. Yet even in the chaos of landing, her hand lingered, steady and reassuring, as if to remind me that what had happened in the air wasn't just imagination. When we finally slowed, she withdrew, smoothing her uniform, her composure intact once more. But before stepping away, she leaned closer, her voice barely audible over the bustle of disembarking passengers. "Gate B, 30 minutes, she murmured, as though offering a secret. I blinked, my pulse leaping. She didn't wait for a response, just gave the faintest smile before turning down the aisle, guiding others with the grace of someone who had done this countless times. But this time was different. As the passengers filed out and the cabin emptied, I sat for a moment longer, the echo of her touch still warm against my skin. Outside, the world was waking, busy, ordinary. Inside, I carried the quiet certainty that something extraordinary had just begun. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more slow burn age gap romances. And let me know in the comments.